The wind on the helipad was freezing, but the cold metal pressed against my temple was colder. I stood on the edge of the skyscraper, the lights of Seoul blurred by the tears in my eyes, as a man I'd never met before screamed demands into the night. I never imagined my life would reach a breaking point like this, suspended between the clouds and a bullet. But that was the consequence of a single, impulsive kiss with the most dangerous man in South Korea. My name is Zuri, and one moment of reckless grief had dragged me into a world I never knew existed. A world of obsidian shadows, obsession, and a love so intense it threatened to swallow me whole. If you're ready for this wild ride, hit that subscribe button and buckle up. Trust me, you won't believe how this ends. Let me take you back to where it all started 3 weeks ago, on the night my perfect life caught fire. That Tuesday afternoon, I was on top of the world. It was my 5-year anniversary with Julian, and I'd planned the ultimate surprise. I'd closed a massive deal at the firm early, picked up a vintage bottle of wine, and spent a small fortune on a silk dress that made my pulse race just looking at it. Julian was my rock. Ambitious, supportive, and safe. The kind of man who represented the stability I'd fought my whole life to achieve. Or so I believed. I practically floated down the hallway of our luxury condo, balancing the wine in one hand while searching for my keys with the other. My mind was full of thoughts about our future. Maybe even a ring. I had no idea how wrong I was. I unlocked the door quietly, holding my breath, hoping to catch him off guard with a kiss. The foyer was hauntingly still. No music, no welcome home, honey. Just a heavy, suffocating silence. I set the wine down on the marble console and headed toward the bedroom. That was when I heard it, a sound that made my heart drop into my stomach. A woman's rhythmic, muffled giggle coming from behind our door. My legs carried me forward on pure, numb instinct. I pushed the door open, and the woman I used to be died in that doorway. Julian wasn't alone. He was in our bed, the bed we'd picked out together, with Chloe, the assistant I'd invited to our Thanksgiving dinner last year. They didn't even hear the wine glass shatter at my feet. They were too busy destroying my soul. My world was built on a foundation of calibrated precision. As a senior partner at one of the most prestigious law firms in Seoul, I lived by the clock, the billable hour, and the absolute necessity of order. My apartment was a reflection of that. A glass-walled sanctuary overlooking the Han River, where every book was spine-aligned and every shadow knew its place. I called it my glass house, not because it was fragile, but because it was transparent, honest, and safe. Or so I had convinced myself. That Tuesday afternoon, the air felt lighter than usual. I had spent months meticulously planning this evening. It was our 5-year anniversary. The half-decade mark that felt like the threshold to the rest of our lives. Julian and I were the it couple of our social circle, the high-powered attorney and the rising star in venture capital. We were stable, we were successful, and we were envied. I left the firm at 4 p.m., a rare indulgence that felt like a secret thrill. In the back seat of the car, I checked the list on my phone one last time. The vintage 1996 Bordeaux was already breathing on the Marble Island. The reservation at the city's most exclusive rooftop garden was confirmed for 9 p.m. But before the dinner, there was the real surprise. A delicate piece of obsidian black silk and lace I'd hidden in the back of my closet, a garment that cost more than some people's monthly rent and promised a side of me I rarely let Julian see. I stepped into the elevator of our complex, catching my reflection in the polished brass doors. My navy suit was crisp. My hair was pinned into a perfect severe chignon, and my expression was one of quiet, contented victory. I felt like the architect of a masterpiece. My life was exactly where I wanted it to be, shielded from the chaos of the world, anchored by a man who was as reliable as a Swiss watch. 5 years, I whispered to the empty elevator, a small, genuine smile tugging at my lips. I imagined Julian's face when he walked through the door. I imagined the weight of the small velvet box I hoped he was carrying in his pocket. My mind was a whirlwind of white lilies, future blueprints, and the comforting hum of a life where nothing ever went wrong. I practically floated down the hallway, the vintage wine bottle tucked under my arm, my keys already in hand. I was a woman who had everything under control, standing on the precipice of a perfect future, completely unaware that the glass was already beginning to crack. The silence of the apartment should have been my first warning. Usually by this time, the soft jazz Julian liked would be filtering through the integrated speakers, or I'd hear the rhythmic tapping of his fingers on a laptop. But as I crossed the threshold, the air felt stagnant, heavy with a stillness that didn't belong in a home filled with celebration. I set the vintage wine on the counter, the muffled clink of glass against marble sounding like a strike against a tuning fork. "Julian!" I called out, my voice bright, still carrying the residual warmth of my commute. No answer. I frowned, glancing at his leather briefcase resting haphazardly by the door. He was home. A small, playful thrill raced through me. Perhaps he was the one trying to surprise me. I kicked off my heels and moved toward the master suite, my feet silent on the plush rug. I had the silk lingerie clutched in my hand, a secret weapon for a night that was supposed to redefine us. But as I reached the hallway, a sound sliced through the quiet. It wasn't coming from our bedroom. It was coming from the guest suite at the end of the hall, the room we rarely used, reserved for visiting family or late-night work marathons. It was a laugh. High, melodic, and intimately familiar. It was the sound of a woman who was comfortable, a woman who was being adored. My heart, which had been light only moments ago, suddenly felt like a lead weight sinking into my stomach. Stop. The hallway seemed to stretch, the walls of my glass house closing in. I told myself it was the TV. I told myself Julian was on a conference call. But the air changed, thick with the scent of a perfume that wasn't mine. A cloying floral musk that belonged to Chloe, the assistant I had mentored, the girl I had invited into our lives out of pity. My hand reached for the door handle. My fingers were trembling so violently I could hear the metal rattle against the wood. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct I possessed as a lawyer told me that once evidence is seen, it cannot be unheard. Once the truth is out, the case is closed. Pushed. The door swung open on silent hinges, revealing a tableau of absolute destruction. There, beneath the silver-gray sheets I had picked out, was the man I had spent 5 years building a life with. He wasn't just with her. He was lost in her. The way he held her waist, the way he whispered into her ear, it was a language of intimacy he had stopped using with me months ago. Julian looked up, his eyes widening, the color draining from his face until he looked like a ghost inhabiting a stranger's body. Chloe didn't even look ashamed, she looked triumphant. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the wine. I simply stood there as the glass around me finally shattered. In that one horrific second, the Zuri who believed in safety, in 5-year plans, and in the perfect man died. The silk lingerie slipped from my fingers, falling to the floor like a discarded skin. I turned and walked away, the sound of my own heart breaking the only noise left in a house that was no longer a home. My old life was gone, and as I stepped back out into the humid Seoul night, I realized I didn't want to be safe anymore. I wanted to burn. The streetlights of Seoul blurred into long weeping streaks of neon as I walked, my bare feet hitting the pavement with a cold, grounding rhythm. I didn't feel the chill. The heat of the betrayal was a furnace in my chest, incinerating the woman who had spent 5 years meticulously building a fortress of lies. Julian's face, Chloe's smirk, the silver-gray sheets, it all felt like a movie I had watched a lifetime ago. I reached the curb and hailed a taxi, the driver's eyes widening as he took in my disheveled state and the shoes dangling from my fingertips. I didn't care. The Grand Hyatt, I rasped. Once inside my temporary sanctuary, a cold, clinical efficiency took over. I didn't cry. Crying was for the Zuri who still had something to lose. I went to my phone, my thumb hovering over the Select All button in our shared photo album. 5 years of birthdays, promotions, and quiet mornings evaporated in a single tap. Delete. I went to my contacts and blocked his number, then Chloe's, then every mutual friend who would undoubtedly try to mediate my ruin. Block. I pulled my carry-on from the closet and began to pack, but I didn't reach for my blazers or my sensible pumps. I reached for the rebellion I had been hiding even from myself. I threw in the red silk slip dress I'd bought on a whim in Paris and never had the courage to wear. I packed the dark, blood-red lipstick that Julian had always said was too much for a partner at the firm. I was stripping away the costume of the senior partner, the dutiful girlfriend, the safe choice. By 11 p.m., I stood before the vanity mirror, looking at a stranger. My hair was down, a dark, wild curtain against my shoulders. The red silk clung to my curves like a second skin, bold and unapologetic. I looked like a warning. "Where to, miss?" the doorman asked as I stepped back out into the night, my heels clicking like a countdown on the marble. "The eclipse," I said. He hesitated, his professional mask flickering. The eclipse wasn't a place for socialites or lawyers. It was an underground heartbeat located in the bowels of the Gangnam district, a place where the city's shadows went to play and where the law ended at the velvet rope. It was the most dangerous club in the city, the rumored playground of the elite and the untouchable. "Are you sure, Miss Brooks? It's intense tonight." "I'm counting on it," I replied, stepping into the waiting black car. As we descended into the heart of the district, the air grew thick with the scent of rain and expensive exhaust. I watched my reflection in the window, the girl who played it safe disappearing into the darkness of the city. I didn't want a glass house anymore. I didn't want a 5-year plan. I wanted to walk into the fire and see what was left of me when the smoke cleared. I was heading into the dragon's mouth, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the teeth. The entrance to the eclipse was nothing more than an unmarked, heavy iron door tucked into a damp alleyway, but the moment I stepped inside, the world of legal briefs and billable hours evaporated. The air was a thick, intoxicating cocktail of expensive cologne, aged bourbon, and the low-frequency hum of a bass line that felt like a physical pulse against my ribs. I didn't stop at the main floor, where the bodies were a frantic, sweating mass of neon-lit motion. I moved toward the back, where the shadows grew long and the security grew silent. The ascent to the VVIP lounge felt like climbing toward the peak of a dark mountain. Here, the frantic energy of the club was replaced by a pressurized, lethal stillness. The decor was all obsidian stone and brushed gold, dimly lit by amber flickers that made the room feel like a modern cathedral for the godless. Men in tailored suits stood with their hands clasped, their eyes scanning the room with a clinical detachment that told me they weren't here for the music. I felt the shift in the atmosphere before I saw him. It was as if the oxygen in the room had suddenly thinned, leaving me light-headed and hyper-aware. I smoothed the red silk of my dress, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm that the bass couldn't hide. I wasn't just a lawyer tonight. I was a woman looking for the edge of the world. Then I saw him. He was seated in the far corner, a space that seemed to pull all the light and heat of the lounge toward it. He was shirtless beneath a sharp charcoal blazer, his lean, powerful chest marked by the faint, jagged lines of a history I couldn't yet read. He didn't move as I approached, but the energy radiating from him was a coiled, predatory force. This was Kang Min-hyuk, the man the city whispered about in tones of equal parts reverence and terror. I stopped a few feet away, my chin tilted up, refusing to let the trembling in my knees reach my expression. For a long, agonizing moment, he didn't acknowledge me. He simply swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his movements fluid and precise. Then he looked up. His gaze was obsidian, dark, impenetrable, and ancient. It wasn't just a look, it was an interrogation. Those eyes stripped away my red silk rebellion, my career, and the wreckage of my 5-year plan, leaving nothing but my raw, shivering soul. He didn't smile. He didn't welcome me. He simply watched me with a gaze that suggested he had been waiting for me to walk into his den for a very long time. In that silence, I realized that Julian's betrayal hadn't just ended my life. It had delivered me to a man who didn't believe in the word no. I had come looking for danger, and as I met Min-hyuk's eyes, I knew I had found the end of my freedom. The silence of the lounge was a suffocating weight, but the air outside on the balcony was sharp with the scent of ozone and the coming storm. I had fled the obsidian heat of Min-hyuk's gaze, needing the city's rain to wash away the feeling of being hunted. The glass door slid shut behind me, muffled by the distant rhythmic roar of the soul traffic. Rain began to fall in thin silver needles, slicking the marble beneath my feet and drenching the red silk of my dress until it felt like a second, heavier skin. I didn't have to turn around to know he was there. The temperature of the air changed first, a sudden magnetic pull that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. Then came the sound, the slow, deliberate click of his dress shoes against the wet stone. "The dragon's den is a dangerous place to run from," Min-hyuk said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that cut through the sound of the rain. I turned slowly, gripping the cold iron railing. He was leaning against the doorframe, his charcoal blazer discarded, his white shirt damp and clinging to the powerful lines of his shoulders. He looked like a storm-given human form, dark, beautiful, and utterly destructive. "I wasn't running," I lied, my voice steadier than I felt. "I was looking for air. Everything in there is a lie." He stepped closer, moving into the rain as if he were part of it. He stopped only inches away, his presence overwhelming, blocking out the city lights. "And what do you find out here, Zuri?" "The truth." I looked up at him, the rain trailing down my cheeks like cold tears. Julian's betrayal, the 5 years of wasted safety, and the suffocating pressure of my perfect life rose up in me, curdling into a sudden, reckless dare. I was tired of being the woman who waited for permission. I was tired of being the one who was chosen. Tonight I would be the one who claimed. "I find that I'm not afraid of the fire anymore," I whispered. I didn't give him time to react. I reached up, my fingers cold as they tangled in his wet hair, and pulled him down to me. It was a dare to the universe, a desperate attempt to feel something more powerful than my own grief. I pressed my lips to his, expecting a moment of escape. Instead, I found an explosion. The air shifted from cold to electric in a heartbeat. The world didn't just stop. It inverted. The moment our lips touched, the passivity I expected from a stranger vanished. Min-hyuk didn't just receive the kiss. He seized it. His hands, large and searingly hot, slammed against my waist, pulling me flush against his hard frame until the breath left my lungs. The kiss was dark, possessive, and thick with a hunger that made my knees buckle. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a transaction of souls. The rain was freezing, but where he touched me, I was burning. In that single rain-drenched moment, I realized I hadn't just crossed a line. I had jumped off a cliff. I had looked into the abyss, and the abyss hadn't just looked back. It had reached out and pulled me into the dark. I had wanted to feel alive, but as Min-hyuk's mouth claimed mine, I realized I had just signed away my life. If the kiss had begun as my desperate attempt to reclaim a sense of power, it ended the second Min-hyuk's pulse met mine. The moment I felt his hand slide from my waist to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling with a bruising grip in my rain-drenched hair, the power dynamic didn't just shift, it shattered. This wasn't a response to my dare. It was an annexation. He backed me against the cold stone balustrade, the rain still lashing down around us, but I couldn't feel the chill anymore. The only reality was the searing heat of his body pressing me into the railing and the suffocating intensity of his mouth on mine. It was a kiss that tasted of steel and expensive scotch, a dark, territorial claim that made my previous life, the life of spreadsheets, courtrooms, and Julian's lukewarm affection, seem like a flickering candle extinguished by a hurricane. I tried to gasp for air, but he caught the sound, drinking it down as if he were starving for the very soul I was so ready to discard. His hands were everywhere, possessive and heavy, mapping out my skin as if he were marking the boundaries of a new territory. The safe Zuri, the woman who meticulously planned her 5-year goals, screamed at me to run, to pull away, to find the exit. But the new Zuri, the one born from the wreckage of the guest room betrayal, leaned into the fire. When he finally pulled back, he didn't let me go. He kept his forehead pressed against mine, his breath coming in jagged, hot bursts that mingled with the mist. His obsidian eyes were no longer just distant and cold. They were burning with a terrifying dark light. He looked at me not as a woman he had just met, but as a prize he had been waiting a lifetime to seize. "You think this is a game?" he whispered, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that hummed against my lips. His grip on my neck tightened just enough to make me tilt my head back, exposing my throat to the rain and his predatory gaze. "You think you can just walk into my world, touch me like that, and walk away back to your glass house?" I tried to speak, but the words died in my throat. The city lights behind him seemed to fade, leaving only the two of us in a pressurized vacuum of shadow and silk. "You have no idea what you've started, Zuri," he growled, his thumb tracing the line of my lower lip with a pressure that was almost painful. It was a vow, not a warning. "You didn't just ask for a kiss. You asked for a master. And in my world, once I lay my hands on something, I never let it go." He stepped back, the sudden absence of his heat feeling like a physical blow. He didn't offer a hand or a smile. He simply watched me, his silhouette sharp against the lightning that flickered over the Seoul skyline. I stood there, shivering in my ruined red silk, realizing that my rebellion had been too successful. I had come to the eclipse to lose myself, but as I looked into Min-hyuk's eyes, I realized I had been found by the only man who could make sure I never found my way back. The door to my old life hadn't just closed. He had locked it from the outside. The morning light was a clinical, blinding white that sliced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Hyatt suite, demanding an account of the previous night's sins. I woke up with my heart hammering against my ribs, the ghost of a crushing grip still lingering on the back of my neck. For a few disoriented seconds, I expected to see the familiar beige walls of my glass house, and hear the mundane hum of Julian's coffee maker. Instead, there was only the vast, expensive silence of a luxury tomb. I sat up, the silk sheets sliding down my skin, and realized I was alone. The red dress lay crumpled on the floor like a bloodstain on the cream carpet. My lips felt swollen, sensitized by a hunger that hadn't belonged to me, and the scent of sandalwood and winter air, Min-hyuk's scent, seemed to have woven itself into the very fabric of the room. I waited for the door to open, for a guard to appear, or for the man himself to step out of the shadows and claim the ownership he had promised on that balcony. But as the minutes ticked by, the suite remained empty. There was no note on the nightstand, no obsidian black box, and no lingering shadow. He had simply vanished, leaving me with the wreckage of my own choices. "It was just the rain," I whispered to the empty room, my voice sounding hollow and desperate. "Just the adrenaline. Just a mistake." I stumbled into the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face, trying to scrub away the memory of his hands. I looked into the mirror, searching for the senior partner, the woman who handled multimillion-dollar mergers without breaking a sweat. I needed her back. I needed the Zuri who lived by logic and precedent. That kiss hadn't been a blood oath. It had been a lapse in judgment triggered by a traumatic betrayal. People kissed strangers in clubs every night. People made reckless dares when their lives shattered. It didn't mean my soul was forfeit. It didn't mean the law of the city had been rewritten. I dressed in the most conservative suit I had packed, a charcoal gray armor that felt stiff and reassuring. I pinned my hair back into its usual tight chignon, hiding the wild curtain that had been tangled in his fingers only hours ago. By the time I checked out of the hotel, I had constructed a temporary scaffold of denial. I would go to the office. I would bury myself in the merger files. I would pretend that Kong Min-hyuk was nothing more than a fever dream brought on by a rainstorm. But as I stepped out onto the curb and waited for my car, I couldn't shake the feeling of a cold weight settling in the pit of my stomach. The city felt different, less like a home and more like a maze where every corner held a hidden eye. I told myself it was a one-time mistake, a momentary crossing of paths that would never happen again. I told myself I was free. I didn't notice the black sedan idling 3 cars down, its tinted windows reflecting the morning sun like a dark, unblinking eye. I didn't see the driver speak into a radio as I pulled away. I was too busy lying to myself, unaware that in Min-hyuk's world, a vanishing act wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of the hunt. The fluorescent lights of Brooks and Associates felt like a surgical theater, cold and unforgiving against my skin. I sat at my mahogany desk, surrounded by the familiar fortress of leather-bound case files and the low hum of the air conditioning, trying to manifest the version of myself that existed 48 hours ago. I focused on the merger contracts for the Lee Corporation, my eyes tracing the same line of text for the 10th time. Parties of the first part. But the words were just ink on paper, devoid of their usual gravity. My body was present, but my senses were elsewhere, tuned to a frequency that didn't belong in a law firm. Every time the glass door to my office hissed open, my heart did a jagged somersault against my ribs. Every time my assistant, Sarah, walked by with a stack of papers, I looked for the shadow of a man who shouldn't have been there. "Zuri, are you all right?" Sarah asked, pausing in the doorway. "You've been staring at that page since the morning briefing." "I'm fine," I snapped, the sharpness of my voice surprising even me. I softened my tone with a tight, artificial smile. "Just a long night of research, Sarah. Leave the files on the credenza." I waited for her to leave before I allowed my gaze to drift toward the window. My office was on the 22nd floor, a height that usually made the city feel small and manageable. But today the world below looked like a chessboard. And right there, idling at the curb directly beneath my window, was the black sedan. It hadn't moved in 4 hours. Its windows were an impenetrable, light-sucking void, reflecting nothing but the gray Seoul sky. I told myself it was a coincidence. This was a busy district. Black cars were the uniform of the elite. But when I left for lunch, the sedan glided into traffic 2 cars behind my taxi. When I stopped at a chemist for aspirin, it was parked across the street, its engine a low, vibrating growl I could feel in my teeth. The feeling was no longer just paranoia. It was a physical weight, like an invisible hand resting on the back of my neck. I felt watched in the elevator. I felt watched in the marble lobby. Even in the ladies' room, the silence felt heavy, as if the air itself was reporting back to him. Min-hyuk hadn't called. He hadn't sent a message. He was doing something far more effective. He was erasing the boundaries of my privacy. Every time I caught the reflection of that car in a shop window, I heard his voice from the balcony. In my world, once I lay my hands on something, I never let it go. I was back in my safe life, but the safety felt like a thin sheet of ice over a dark, deep lake. I was beginning to realize that the vanishing act in the hotel suite wasn't an exit. It was a leash. He was letting me run just far enough to believe I was free, while the invisible eyes followed my every move, waiting for the moment I realized that there was no place in this city where he wasn't already standing. By the time the sun began to set, casting long, bruised shadows across my office, I wasn't working anymore. I was just waiting for the shadow to finally step out of the car. The paranoia had become a second skin, itchy and impossible to shed. By the time I reached my office the next morning, my nerves were frayed into jagged wires. Every time the elevator chimed, I jumped. Every time a courier walked past the glass partitions of the firm, I held my breath. I was a senior partner at a top-tier law firm, a woman who had spent years mastering the art of the poker face, yet I felt like a child lost in a forest of predators. At 11 a.m., my assistant, Sarah, walked in carrying a large obsidian black box. There was no shipping label, no courier's note, just a card of heavy cream-colored cardstock with my name written in a precise, elegant hand that made my stomach do a slow, nauseating somersault. "A delivery for you, Zuri," she said, her eyes bright with curiosity. The courier said it was urgent and non-negotiable. I waited until she left, closing the heavy oak door and locking it, a gesture of privacy that felt more like a desperate attempt at sanctuary. I stared at the box for a long time, the silence of the office feeling less like peace and more like an indrawn breath. Finally, I lifted the lid. The first thing I saw was a mess of lace and silk. My breath hitched. It was the expensive lingerie I had bought for Julian, the surprise that was supposed to ignite our 5-year anniversary. I had left it on the floor of the apartment when I fled, a discarded relic of a dead life. But it wasn't a gift anymore. It was a message. The delicate fabric had been systematically shredded, the intricate lace torn into jagged ribbons that looked like spiderwebs caught in a storm. It was a violent, silent execution of my past, a physical manifestation of the way Min-hyuk intended to discard everything I used to be. Beneath the ruins of my former self lay a secondary layer of tissue paper, black and crisp. When I pulled it back, the air left my lungs. Nestled in the box was a gown made of midnight blue velvet, so dark it appeared almost black. It was a masterpiece of design, the kind of garment that sat in the windows of boutiques where prices were never listed because those who entered didn't need to ask. The fabric felt like a living thing against my fingertips, heavy, soft, and impossibly expensive. It was a $10,000 piece of armor. I reached for the card. I flipped it over, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. There was no signature, only a single sentence that turned the luxury of the gift into a terrifying promise. Replace the old memories with something worth keeping. I'll see you soon, Zuri. The gown wasn't a gift of affection. It was a gift of fear. It was Min-hyuk's way of telling me that my walls were non-existent. He had been inside my home. He had seen my most private shames. He was stripping away my choices, one by one, replacing my safe history with his own dark future. I slumped into my leather chair, clutching the velvet to my chest, realizing that the black sedan outside wasn't just following me. It was waiting for me to put on the uniform of my new life and step back into the shadows I had tried so hard to escape. The blue velvet gown sat on my office sofa like a silent, dark omen, but I refused to let it weigh me down. If Min-hyuk wanted a confrontation, he wouldn't have to wait for a rainy balcony or a cryptic delivery. I donned my sharpest charcoal wool suit, a garment that felt like a shield, and marched toward the heart of the city's financial district. I wasn't going to be a ghost in my own life any longer. I wasn't going to wait for a black sedan to decide my destination. If Kong Min-hyuk wanted to play a game of shadows, I would drag him into the light. The Kong Global Headquarters was a monolith of steel and glass that seemed to pierce the very clouds. The lobby was a cathedral of cold minimalism, where the air felt thinner and more expensive. I didn't stop at the reception desk. I walked with the borrowed confidence of a woman who had already lost everything and therefore had nothing left to fear. The security guards moved to intercept me, but one look at my face, a mask of cold, incandescent fury, made them hesitate. "I'm here to see Min-hyuk," I said, my voice echoing off the marble. "Tell him Zuri Eloan Brooks is here to return his gift." 5 minutes later, I was standing in the inner sanctum on the top floor. The office was vast, overlooking the sprawling chaos of Seoul, but Min-hyuk made the space feel small. He was behind a desk of carved obsidian, a phone to his ear, his expression as unreadable as a frozen lake. He didn't look surprised to see me. In fact, he looked as though he had been counting the seconds until my arrival. He signaled for his assistants to leave, and the heavy doors clicked shut with a finality that made my pulse spike. "I don't want your dresses, and I don't want your protection," I snapped, the words tumbling out before the silence could swallow them. I marched to his desk, slamming the cream-colored card from the box onto the polished surface. "I am a private citizen, Min-hyuk. I am not a piece of territory you can mark. I want my freedom back. I want you to call off your dogs and stop following me." Min-hyuk stood slowly, his height casting a long, jagged shadow across the room. He didn't look angry. He looked amused, which was infinitely more terrifying. He walked around the desk, his movements fluid and predatory, until he was standing just inches from me. The scent of sandalwood and winter air returned, the same scent that had haunted my suite, and it threatened to undermine my resolve. "Freedom," he repeated, the word sounding like a foreign concept on his tongue. He reached out not to touch me, but to trace the edge of the desk behind me, effectively trapping me in his orbit. "You think freedom is what you had with that boy who lied to you. You think safety is living in a glass house waiting for the next stone to be thrown. I was fine until I met you," I whispered, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. "No, Zuri. You were asleep," Min-hyuk said, his voice dropping to a low, vibrating hum. He leaned in, his obsidian eyes locking onto mine. "You initiated that kiss. You stepped into my world and signaled that you were ready for something real. In my world, there is no back. There is only forward. You demanded my attention and now you have it. You can't ask a storm to stop just because you've realized how much it can destroy. I stood rooted to the spot, my breath hitching as Min-hyuk stepped deeper into my personal space. The sheer arrogance of his words should have made me scream, but there was a gravity in his tone that silenced my defiance. He didn't look like a man playing a game of seduction. He looked like a general surveying a battlefield that I hadn't even realized I was standing on. You think this is about a dress or a car following you? He asked, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. He reached past me, his fingers grazing the cold obsidian of his desk as he pulled up a file on a hidden monitor. Look, Zuri. I turned, my eyes scanning the screen. It was a grainy photo of me leaving my office the night before, but it wasn't taken from the black sedan. It was a long-range shot, framed by the crosshairs of a thermal lens. My blood went cold. His name is Han-suk, Min-hyuk said, his expression hardening into something ancient and lethal. He has spent a decade trying to find a fracture in my foundation, a single point of pressure he could use to bring my world down. He was at the eclipse that night. He saw the balcony. He saw the way I held you. I shook my head, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the desk. It was just a kiss. It was dark. How could he possibly? In my world, a kiss isn't just anything, Min-hyuk interrupted, his hand finally moving to close around my arm, his grip firm but strangely grounding. To Han-suk, you aren't a woman or a lawyer. You are a vulnerability. You have been marked as mine, and in his mind, destroying you is the quickest way to destroy me. He doesn't care about your freedom or your glass house. He only cares about the leverage you provide. The room seemed to tilt. The safe life I had been trying so hard to reclaim felt like a paper shield against a monsoon. I looked at the crosshairs on the screen and realized that the black sedan hadn't been a threat. It had been a barrier. So what? I'm a target now. I rasped, the reality of my situation finally breaking through my denial. Min-hyuk stepped closer, forcing me to look up into the dark, unrelenting depth of his eyes. The amusement was gone, replaced by a terrifying, absolute conviction. He reached up, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with a possessive heat that made my heart hammer against my ribs. You are a target, he confirmed, his voice a low, vibrating vow. But you are a target under my protection. Han-suk thinks he can use you to get to me, but he has no idea what I'm willing to burn to keep what is mine. I promise you this, Zuri. As long as you are in my orbit, no hand will touch you, no bullet will find you, and no shadow will cross your path that I haven't cleared first. You may hate the cage, but I will make sure it is the safest place on Earth. He didn't ask for my consent. He didn't ask if I was okay with his terms. He simply delivered the truth like a sentence. I was no longer an independent woman with a 5-year plan. I was a marked woman in a Mafia war, and the only man who could keep me breathing was the same one who refused to let me go. I returned to my office the following morning feeling like a condemned woman walking a tightrope. Min-hyuk's warnings about Han-suk echoed in my mind, but the lawyer in me still clung to the hope that a corporate lobby and a security badge could keep the darkness at bay. I sat at my desk, the midnight blue velvet gown draped over the sofa as a constant, heavy reminder that my world had been irrevocably breached. The attack didn't start with a bang. It started with a silence. Around 2 p.m., the usual white noise of the firm, the rhythmic tapping of keyboards, the low murmur of paralegals, the hum of the copier, simply vanished. I looked up from a brief, my heart crawling into my throat. Through the glass walls of my office, I saw 3 men entering the floor. They weren't wearing the charcoal suits of Min-hyuk's security. They wore maintenance jumpsuits that hung too heavy on their frames, hiding the unmistakable bulk of hardware beneath the fabric. They weren't here for a deposition. They were here for me. I stood up, my chair screeching against the floor, but before I could even reach for the door, the first man drew a suppressed weapon. The glass of my office didn't shatter. It disintegrated into 1,000 crystal diamonds under a silent spray of lead. I dove behind my mahogany desk, the wood splintering above my head. The air was suddenly thick with the scent of ozone and pulverized drywall. "Zuri Brooks, come out and this stays clean," a voice barked, cold and devoid of mercy. I squeezed my eyes shut, my fingers digging into the carpet. I had spent my life arguing before judges, believing that words were the ultimate power. But as the heavy boots of the hit squad crunched over the glass toward my desk, I realized how useless my degrees were in the face of a cold barrel. Then, the world exploded into a different kind of violence. The service elevator behind the hit squad hissed open, and 4 figures emerged like shadows detached from the walls. These were Min Hyuk's cleaners. They moved with a terrifying synchronized grace that made the attackers look like amateurs. There were no shouts, no warnings, only the clinical, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of silenced fire. I peeked over the edge of the desk just as one of the men in jumpsuits was spun around by the force of a bullet, his weapon clattering to the floor. Min Hyuk's men didn't just fight, they deconstructed the threat. In less than 30 seconds, the lobby was a graveyard of broken glass and still bodies. The lead cleaner, a man with a jagged scar across his temple, stepped over the wreckage and looked directly at me. He didn't offer a hand. He just touched his earpiece. "The asset is secure," he said into the comms, his voice as flat as a dial tone. "Bring the car around. We're moving her to the estate now." I looked at the carnage in my workplace, the place where I had built my reputation, now stained with the grim reality of a mafia war. The glass house hadn't just cracked, it had been leveled. I realized then that Min Hyuk hadn't been threatening me when he promised protection. He had been stating a fact. My life as Zuri Eloan Brooks, senior partner, ended the moment that first bullet hit my window. I was no longer a person. I was a prize in a war I didn't understand, and the only path left led straight into Min Hyuk's waiting arms. The smell of gunpowder and pulverized drywall clung to the back of my throat, a bitter metallic reminder that my life had been reduced to a pile of rubble and broken glass. I was still huddled behind the remains of my mahogany desk, my hands pressed so hard against the carpet that my nails were stained with dust. The cleaners stood like stone statues amidst the carnage, their presence offering a terrifying brand of safety that felt more like a siege. The heavy thud of footsteps echoed from the hallway, deliberate, rhythmic, and heavy with authority. I looked up through the haze of settling dust as the elevator doors hissed open once more. Min Hyuk stepped into the wreckage of my office, his long charcoal coat billowing behind him like a dark sail. He didn't look at the bodies on the floor. He didn't even acknowledge the shattered glass crunching beneath his handmade Italian shoes. His obsidian eyes were locked onto mine with a singular, ferocious intensity. He reached the desk and looked down at me. The cold, corporate shark I had confronted in his office was gone, replaced by something much more primal. He reached down, his large hand wrapping firmly around my upper arm to pull me to my feet. I stumbled, my knees feeling like water, but his grip was an anchor, unyielding and absolute. "Are you hurt?" he rasped. It wasn't a question of concern. It was a demand for a status report. I think I'm okay," I managed to whisper, though my voice sounded foreign to my own ears. I looked back at my desk, at the framed degrees on the wall that were now riddled with bullet holes, and at the midnight blue velvet gown draped over the sofa, miraculously untouched by the blood. "Julian. The firm. They tried to kill me, Min Hyuk. They tried to take what belongs to me," he corrected, his voice a low, vibrating growl. He didn't let go of my arm. Instead, he pulled me closer, his warmth a sharp contrast to the chilling stillness of the room. "The firm is gone, Zuri. Hansuk has burned your bridges. You cannot go back to that apartment. You cannot go back to that life. If you step outside these doors alone, you are a dead woman." The finality of his words hit me harder than the bullets had. I looked at the exit, then back at him. I realized then that this retrieval wasn't just a rescue. It was a capture. He was taking me out of the fire, But he was leading me into a fortress I would likely never leave. My career, my independence, the Zuri who lived by the law, they were all casualties of this afternoon's war. He began to lead me toward the private elevator, his body shielding mine from the sight of the dead men in the lobby. I felt the weight of his possessiveness settling over me like a heavy cloak. I wanted to fight it, to demand my autonomy back, but as I looked at the black-clad soldiers flanking us, I knew the truth. The world I knew had ended the moment I kissed the dragon. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Home," he said, his eyes flashing with a dark, triumphant light. "To my home, where the world can't touch you unless I allow it." As the elevator doors closed on the ruins of my office, I caught one last glimpse of my name on the glass partition, now cracked and obscured by shadow. I wasn't going home. I was going to his palace, and as the descent began, I realized that for the first time in my life, I was utterly, terrifyingly his. The drive up the winding mountain pass felt like a slow ascent into another realm. The city of Seoul was soon nothing more than a distant, flickering memory of neon and glass, buried beneath the jagged silhouettes of ancient pines and the gathering mist. I sat in the back of the armored sedan, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, watching the back of Min-hyuk's head. He hadn't spoken since we left the ruins of my office, but his presence was a heavy, suffocating weight that filled the cabin. As we reached the summit, the forest opened up to reveal a sprawling fortress of dark stone and floor-to-ceiling glass. It was a masterpiece of architectural intimidation, a monolithic structure that seemed to grow directly out of the mountainside. The perimeter was patrolled by men in charcoal suits, their movements as synchronized and lethal as the cleaners who had dismantled the hit squad at the firm. The car slowed as we approached the massive iron gates. They didn't just open. They retreated like the jaws of a leviathan. We glided through, and the moment the rear tires cleared the threshold, the gates hissed shut behind us with a heavy mechanical finality that vibrated through the floorboards. The sound of the lock engaging echoed through the quiet valley like a gavel hitting a bench. The glass house I had lived in was gone. This was the golden cage. Min-hyuk stepped out first, and before I could even reach for the handle, he was there, opening the door and offering a hand that felt more like a shackle than an invitation. I stepped out onto the gravel, the mountain air sharp and thin in my lungs. The silence here was absolute, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk and the rhythmic crunch of boots on stone. He led me through the grand foyer, a cathedral of marble and shadow where silent, bowing staff moved like ghosts in the periphery. They didn't look at me. They looked through me, as if I were a new piece of furniture being added to the collection. Every silk rug, every piece of obsidian art, and every flickering sconce screamed of a wealth that was bought with blood and maintained with iron. We stopped in the center of a vast hall that overlooked the valley. I turned to Min-hyuk, my voice a fragile thread in the cavernous space. "How long am I supposed to stay here?" "Have a life, Min-hyuk. I have a firm to rebuild, I have." "You have nothing but what I give you," he interrupted, his voice a low, vibrating growl that seemed to pull the oxygen from the room. He stepped into my space, his warmth the only thing keeping me from the chill of the marble. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with a slow, deliberate pressure that made my heart hammer against my ribs. His obsidian eyes locked onto mine, stripping away the last of my legal arguments and my desperate hope for autonomy. He looked at me with an intensity that was both terrifying and intoxicating, the look of a man who had finally brought his prize home. "You don't understand the rules yet, Zuri," he said, leaning down until his breath ghosted over my ear. "Hansuk made you a target, but I made you a choice. You chose the kiss, and now you live with the consequence. You aren't a guest, and you aren't a prisoner of war." He pulled back just enough to look me in the eye, his hand sliding to the back of my neck to ensure I couldn't pull away. "You're mine until I say otherwise."